Good evening. Tensions in the region continue to rise tonight as the government faces mounting pressure from within its own borders. New demonstrations and an expanded security presence were reported today in several cities. Officials in the capital insist the situation is under control, but opposition groups are calling.
The sun had barely risen over the capital city of TEHRAN when the first gunshots echoed through Liberation Square, shattering the fragile peace that had held for 3 tense days. More than 200 Iranian protesters had gathered in the historic plaza, their voices united in demands for freedom that had been building for decades. Their signs and banners calling for an end to the regime that had ruled their nation with an iron fist for 47 years. They had come from every corner of the Republic of Valdoria, from the industrial cities of the north where workers had labored under impossible conditions, from the agricultural regions of the south where farmers had watched their lands seized by government cronies, from the coastal provinces where fishermen had seen their waters polluted by state-owned factories that answered to no environmental authority. They were young and old, men and women, professionals and laborers, united by a shared conviction that the time for change had finally arrived. For 3 days, the protests had remained peaceful. The demonstrators had organized themselves with remarkable discipline, establishing medical stations and food distribution points, maintaining clear pathways for emergency vehicles, policing their own ranks to prevent the kind of violence that the regime could use as justification for a crackdown. They had learned from the failures of previous movements, from the protests of 2009 that had been crushed with brutal efficiency, from the uprising of 2017 that had been infiltrated and dismantled from within. This time they believed would be different. This time the whole world was watching. This time they had technology on their side, smartphones and social media that could broadcast their struggle to every corner of the globe. This time, they would not be silenced. They were wrong. Supreme Leader Khorram Nazari had ruled Valdoria since seizing power in a military coup 47 years earlier, transforming a struggling democracy into a theocratic dictatorship that combined religious fervor with ruthless political repression. Now 81 years old, his health failing, his grip on power increasingly dependent on the loyalty of the Revolutionary Guard Corps he had created, Nazari watched the protests from his palace compound with a mixture of contempt and calculation. He had survived challenges before. The student uprising of 1987, the workers' revolt of 1994, the Green Movement of 2009. Each time he had responded with overwhelming force, crushing dissent before it could spread, eliminating the leaders who might have united the opposition, demonstrating to his people that resistance was futile. Each time the international community had expressed concern and imposed sanctions and ultimately moved on to other crises, leaving Nazari free to consolidate his control. This time would be no different. The protesters in Liberation Square were numerous, yes, but they were also unarmed, unorganized and ultimately powerless against the machinery of state violence he had spent decades perfecting. They had their signs and their slogans, their dreams of democracy, and their naive faith in the power of peaceful resistance. He had tanks and helicopters, secret police and prison camps, the willingness to do whatever was necessary to maintain his grip on power. On the morning of the 4th day, he gave the order. The attack began at 5:47 a.m., while most of the protesters were still sleeping in the makeshift camps they had established throughout the square. Revolutionary Guard units that had been positioned around the perimeter for days, ostensibly to maintain order, suddenly advanced with weapons drawn. Snipers who had taken positions on the rooftops of surrounding buildings opened fire on the crowd below. Armored vehicles that had been parked on side streets rumbled into the square, their mounted guns adding to the carnage. The protesters had no warning, no chance to flee, no opportunity to negotiate. One moment they were sleeping or preparing breakfast or standing in small groups discussing strategy for the day ahead. The next moment they were dying, cut down by bullets that came from every direction, trampled by crowds fleeing in panic, crushed beneath the treads of vehicles that showed no mercy. Miriam Hosseini was 23 years old, a medical student at Valdoria National University who had come to Liberation Square on the first day of the protests and had stayed ever since, using her training to treat the minor injuries that inevitably occurred in any large gathering. She was checking the bandage on an elderly man's hand when the shooting started, the sound so unexpected that her first thought was that someone had set off fireworks. Then the elderly man's head exploded, and she understood. She ran. Everyone was running, a stampede of humanity desperate to escape the kill zone that Liberation Square had become. She saw people falling around her, some hit by bullets, others trampled by the crowd, still others simply collapsing from shock or exhaustion. She saw a young mother clutching a baby, both of them covered in blood that might have been theirs or might have been someone else's. She saw a teenage boy standing frozen in the middle of the chaos, staring at the body of what might have been his father, unable to process what was happening. She grabbed the boy's arm and pulled him with her, dragging him toward the edge of the square where a narrow alley offered the possibility of escape. Bullets whined past her head, close enough that she could feel the displaced air. People fell in front of her and she jumped over them, her medical training screaming at her to stop and help, her survival instinct overriding everything else. They made it to the alley, she and the boy and perhaps 100 others who had found the same escape route. Behind them, the sounds of gunfire continued, mixed now with screams and explosions and the grinding roar of armored vehicles. The massacre was just beginning. The killing continued for 4 hours. The Revolutionary Guard units swept through Liberation Square with methodical efficiency, shooting anyone who moved, bayoneting the wounded, setting fire to the tents and shelters that the protesters had constructed. When the crowd tried to flee, they found the surrounding streets blocked by additional military units that had been positioned during the night, creating a killing ground from which there was no escape. Some protesters fought back, throwing rocks and bottles at the soldiers, overturning vehicles to create barricades, using whatever they could find as improvised weapons. But rocks and bottles were no match for automatic weapons and armored vehicles. The resistance was crushed as quickly as it arose, its participants added to the growing pile of bodies that covered the ancient cobblestones of Liberation Square. By 10:00 a.m., it was over. The square was silent except for the moans of the wounded and the crackling of fires that still burned among the destroyed encampments. Bodies lay everywhere, thousands of them heaped against barricades and sprawled across the open ground and floating in the fountain at the center of the square that had been a gathering point for protesters just hours before. The water in the fountain had turned red with blood. The Revolutionary Guard began the cleanup immediately, loading bodies onto trucks for disposal at unknown locations, hosing down the cobblestones to wash away the evidence, arresting the wounded and transporting them to detention facilities where they would face interrogation and likely execution. Within hours, Liberation Square would look almost normal, the physical traces of the massacre erased as if it had never happened. But erasing the truth was no longer as simple as it had once been. Throughout the massacre, survivors had been recording everything on their smartphones, uploading footage to social media platforms before their devices could be confiscated, documenting the horror for a global audience that watched in real-time disbelief. Miriam Hosseini was one of those survivors. From her hiding place in the alley, she had filmed what she could see of the killing, her hands shaking so badly that the footage was barely watchable, her voice providing a running commentary that alternated between clinical description and raw terror. When she finally escaped the area hours later, she uploaded the footage to every platform she could access, knowing that it might be the last thing she ever did. The video went viral within hours. Millions of people around the world watched as Valdorian security forces gunned down unarmed protesters, as tanks rolled over bodies, as soldiers executed wounded civilians at point-blank range. The footage was graphic and disturbing and impossible to dismiss as propaganda or exaggeration. It was the truth, documented in high definition, broadcast to every corner of the globe. The international response was immediate and unprecedented. President Jonathan Marshall was in the Situation Room of the White House when the first reports of the massacre reached him, surrounded by his national security team, watching the same horrific footage that was playing on television screens around the world. He was a former general who had spent 30 years in the military before entering politics, a man who understood violence in ways that most politicians did not, who had seen its effects firsthand in conflicts across multiple continents. What he saw on those screens shook him in ways that his years of combat experience had not prepared for. "How many?" he asked, his voice flat with controlled emotion. "Initial estimates are between 200 and 300 dead," replied Secretary of State Elizabeth Warren, her face pale. "But the true number could be higher. The regime is already working to conceal the evidence, and our intelligence assets on the ground have been compromised." And the regime's position? State media is calling it a defensive action against terrorist provocateurs. They're claiming the protesters were armed, that they attacked security forces first, that the military was forced to respond to protect public safety. She shook her head. It's the same playbook they've used before. Deny, deflect, blame the victims. Marshall turned to General Thomas Reeves, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "What are our options?" Reeves pulled up a map on the main display showing Valdoria and the surrounding region. "Mr. President, we have significant assets in the region. Carrier strike groups in the Gulf of Miran, air bases in neighboring Taristan and Karelia, special operations forces positioned for rapid deployment. If you're asking whether we have the capability to respond militarily, the answer is yes. I'm asking what a military response would look like and what it would cost. Reeves exchanged glances with the other military leaders in the room. Sir, Valdoria has one of the largest militaries in the region. 500 EO0 active duty personnel, plus another 300 DOBOS in the Revolutionary Guard. Sophisticated air defense systems, ballistic missile capabilities, proxy forces throughout the region that could strike at our allies and assets. A full-scale military intervention would be a major undertaking, potentially comparable to our operations in the Gulf Wars. I'm not talking about a full-scale intervention. I'm talking about consequences. I'm talking about making sure that what happened in Liberation Square today doesn't go unanswered. The room was silent for a moment. Then National Security Advisor Patricia Holmes spoke up. Mr. President, there's a middle ground between full-scale war and doing nothing. Targeted strikes against the regime's leadership and military infrastructure. Cyber operations against their command and control systems. Support for opposition forces that could challenge the regime from within. We could hurt them significantly without committing to a ground war. And the risks? Escalation, regional destabilization, potential attacks against our allies in Taristan and Karelia, possible involvement of Valdoria's allies, particularly the People's Republic of Xianlong, which has significant economic and military ties to the regime. Holmes paused. It wouldn't be clean or easy, but it would send a message that massacring civilians has consequences. Marshall stood and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of the capital city that spread below him. He thought about the footage he had just watched, about the bodies piled in Liberation Square, about the young people whose only crime had been demanding the freedom that citizens of his own country took for granted. He thought about the world that would exist if such atrocities went unanswered, a world where dictators could murder their own people with impunity, where the powerful could crush the powerless without consequence, where the ideals of human rights and dignity that his nation claimed to stand for were revealed as empty rhetoric. And he thought about the costs of action, the lives that would be lost in any military response, the regional instability that could result, the risk of a wider war that no one wanted and no one could control. It was the kind of decision that presidents were elected to make, the kind that would define his legacy and shape the future of the world, the kind that he would carry with him for the rest of his life, whatever he chose. He turned back to face his advisors. I want options on my desk within 6 hours. Full spectrum from diplomatic pressure to military strikes. I want to understand every possible course of action and every possible consequence. He paused, his expression hardening into something that his staff had rarely seen. And I want the regime in Valdoria to understand something. What they did today will not stand. There will be consequences. The only question is what form those consequences will take. The meeting ended, and the machinery of American power began to turn. The international response to the Liberation Square Massacre, as it came to be known, was swift and coordinated. Within 48 hours, the United Nations Security Council had convened an emergency session. Within 72 hours, a coalition of democratic nations had announced sweeping sanctions against the Valdorian regime. Within a week, President Marshall had delivered an address to the nation that was watched by billions of people around the world. What happened in Liberation Square was not a defensive action, Marshall declared, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of cold fury. It was a massacre. It was the deliberate murder of thousands of innocent civilians whose only crime was demanding the fundamental rights that all human beings deserve. It was an act of barbarism that shocks the conscience and demands response. He paused, letting his words sink in. The United States, along with our allies and partners, will not stand idly by while such atrocities are committed. We are imposing the most comprehensive sanctions ever levied against the Valdorian regime, targeting its leadership, its military, its financial systems, and any individual or entity that supports its reign of terror. We are providing humanitarian assistance to the survivors and refugees who have fled the violence, and we are considering all options, including military action, to ensure that those responsible for this massacre face justice. The message was clear. The question was whether the regime in Valdoria would heed it. Supreme Leader Nazari's response came the following day, delivered in a televised address from his palace compound. He appeared frail but defiant, his voice reedy with age but still carrying the authority that decades of absolute power had bestowed. The enemies of Valdoria have revealed their true intentions, he declared. They seek to destabilize our nation, to impose their corrupt values on our people, to reduce us to a puppet state serving their imperial interests. The so-called protesters who gathered in Liberation Square were not peaceful demonstrators. They were terrorists, trained and funded by foreign powers seeking to overthrow our legitimate government through violence and chaos. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with the zealotry that had sustained him through nearly half a century of rule. We will not be intimidated by threats from the American president or his coalition of puppets. Any military action against Valdoria will be met with devastating retaliation. Our missiles can reach every corner of the region. Our allies stand ready to support us, and our people, united behind the revolutionary government, will never surrender to foreign aggression. The speech was a declaration of defiance, but intelligence analysts noted the hints of desperation beneath the bravado. The sanctions were already biting, cutting off the regime's access to international financial systems, grounding its commercial aircraft, freezing the assets of its leaders in foreign banks. The military was stretched thin, forced to maintain order in a country where protests were now erupting in multiple cities despite the massacre. And the international isolation that had always been manageable was becoming suffocating. The regime was wounded. The question was whether it would lash out in desperation or seek a path toward de-escalation. Inside Valdoria, the massacre had not crushed the protest movement as Nazari had intended. Instead, it had transformed it. The peaceful demonstrations that had characterized the first phase of the uprising gave way to something angrier and more determined. Underground resistance networks that had been dormant for years reactivated. Military officers who had harbored private doubts about the regime began to make contact with opposition groups. The population, traumatized but not broken, began to organize in ways that the security services found increasingly difficult to monitor. Miriam Hosseini became one of the faces of the resistance, her footage from Liberation Square having made her famous around the world. She had gone into hiding after uploading the video, knowing that the regime would be hunting for anyone who had documented the massacre. For weeks, she moved from safe house to safe house, staying one step ahead of the Revolutionary Guard, using encrypted communications to coordinate with other activists. The price on her head was rumored to be substantial. The regime had already executed several people accused of spreading terrorist propaganda about the massacre, their confessions broadcast on state television, their bodies returned to their families with signs of torture. Miriam knew that capture would mean the same fate, or worse. But she also knew that the world was watching, that her continued survival and activism were themselves acts of resistance, that every day she remained free was a defeat for the regime that had tried to silence her. She recorded messages from her hiding places, short videos that circulated on social media despite the government's efforts to block them. She described the mood in the country, the growing defiance, the small acts of rebellion that were accumulating into something larger. She called on the international community to maintain pressure, to not forget the victims of Liberation Square, to understand that the people of Valdoria were still fighting for their freedom. "They can kill us," she said in one video that was viewed more than 50 million times. "They can imprison us and torture us and try to erase us from history. But they cannot kill the idea of freedom. They cannot imprison hope. They cannot torture away the human desire to live with dignity. We will continue to resist. We will continue to fight. And one day, we will win." The video reached President Marshall's desk within hours of its posting. He watched it alone in the Oval Office, moved by the courage of a young woman who had every reason to give up but refused to do so. It reinforced his conviction that the United States could not stand aside while such people were fighting for their lives. The military planning had been proceeding in parallel with the diplomatic efforts. Teams of strategists working around the clock to develop options that would hurt the regime without triggering a wider war. The result was a plan called Operation Crimson Dawn, a series of targeted strikes designed to degrade Valdoria's military capabilities and demonstrate that the international community's warnings were not empty rhetoric. The plan called for cruise missile strikes against Revolutionary Guard command centers, air defense installations, and the intelligence facilities where political prisoners were held. It called for cyber operations that would disable the regime's communication networks and financial systems. It called for support to opposition forces that could capitalize on the chaos to seize territory and establish safe zones for civilians fleeing the violence. It was not a plan for regime change, the strategists were careful to emphasize. It was a plan for consequences, for demonstrating that massacring civilians would not go unpunished, for creating space for the Valdorian people to determine their own future. The decision to launch Operation Crimson Dawn was made on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the Liberation Square Massacre. President Marshall convened his national security team one final time, reviewed the intelligence assessments, weighed the risks and potential consequences, and gave the order. "This is not an action we take lightly," he said. "But there are moments when inaction is itself a choice, when standing aside is complicity. The regime in Valdoria has made its choice. Now we make ours." The first missiles launched at 2:00 a.m. local time, screaming across the Gulf of Miran toward targets that had been precisely mapped and carefully selected. Within minutes, explosions were lighting up the night sky over Karithan, over the military bases where Revolutionary Guard units were stationed, over the intelligence complexes where prisoners were held and interrogated. The regime's air defenses, sophisticated as they were, proved unable to stop the onslaught. The cyber operations had disrupted their radar systems and communication networks, leaving them blind and deaf as the missiles found their targets. Secondary explosions suggested that ammunition depots and fuel storage facilities had been hit. Fires burned across the capital city and in military installations throughout the country. Supreme Leader Nazari was evacuated from his palace compound within minutes of the first explosions, rushed to a bunker deep beneath the mountains north of the capital. From there, he raged at his commanders, demanded retaliation, threatened consequences for anyone who had failed to protect the homeland. But retaliation required capabilities that were rapidly being degraded. The missile batteries that could have struck at regional targets were being systematically destroyed. The air force that could have launched counterattacks was grounded, its runways cratered, its command structure in chaos. The Revolutionary Guard units that had carried out the Liberation Square Massacre were fighting fires and treating casualties rather than projecting power. By dawn, the first phase of Operation Crimson Dawn was complete. The Valdorian military had suffered significant damage, though the full extent would take days to assess. More importantly, the regime had been shown to be vulnerable, its aura of invincibility shattered by an attack it had been unable to prevent or meaningfully respond to. The international reaction was mixed, as expected. Allied nations expressed support for the action, describing it as a proportionate response to an unacceptable atrocity. Russia and China condemned it as an illegal act of aggression, though their rhetoric was notably more restrained than it might have been in the past, suggesting that even they recognized the political difficulty of defending a regime that had just massacred thousands of its own citizens. And inside Valdoria, something extraordinary began to happen. The strikes had not been aimed at civilian targets, and casualties among the general population were minimal. But the psychological impact was enormous. For decades, the regime had told its people that it was powerful, that its enemies were weak, that the Revolutionary Guard was invincible. Now, in a single night, that narrative had been demolished. The mighty military machine that had crushed protests and invaded neighbors and projected power throughout the region had been exposed as vulnerable. The protests that had continued despite the massacre suddenly swelled in size and intensity. People who had been afraid to leave their homes joined demonstrations that blocked major streets. Military units that had been reliable instruments of repression began to waver, some refusing orders to fire on crowds, others simply melting away as soldiers decided that loyalty to a dying regime was not worth dying for. The cracks that had appeared in the regime's foundation after Liberation Square became fissures, then chasms, and the opposition forces that had been organizing in the shadows began to emerge into the light. The collapse of the Valdorian regime took 6 weeks from the first night of Operation Crimson Dawn to the final flight of Supreme Leader Nazari from his mountain bunker. It was not a clean or easy process. There were battles between loyalist forces and defecting military units. There were score-settling and revenge killings that claimed thousands of lives. There were regions where Revolutionary Guard commanders held out for weeks before being overwhelmed or negotiating surrender. But the outcome was never seriously in doubt after that first night. The combination of international pressure, military strikes, and internal uprising proved too much for a regime that had ruled through fear and violence. When fear no longer worked, when the violence could no longer be monopolized, the foundation crumbled. Nazari fled to exile in the People's Republic of Xianlong, one of the few countries willing to offer him sanctuary. He would die there 18 months later, a bitter and broken man whose life's work had been undone in a matter of weeks. The Revolutionary Guard commanders who had ordered the Liberation Square Massacre faced various fates. Some escaped to exile, others were captured and tried for crimes against humanity. Still others were killed in the fighting or by mobs seeking revenge. Miriam Hosseini emerged from hiding on the day that Nazari's flight was announced, walking through the streets of Karitan for the first time in months, surrounded by crowds celebrating a freedom they had almost stopped believing was possible. She was recognized everywhere she went, people stopping to thank her, to embrace her, to tell her that her videos had given them hope during the darkest days. She would go on to play a significant role in the transitional government that guided Valdoria toward its first free elections. She helped establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that documented the regime's crimes. She advocated for the families of those who had died in Liberation Square, ensuring that their sacrifices were not forgotten. But on that first day of freedom, she wasn't thinking about politics or government or the future. She was thinking about the friends she had lost, the bodies she had seen, the horror she had witnessed and documented and survived. She was thinking about the price that had been paid for this moment, and whether it had been worth it. She stood in Liberation Square, now transformed from a site of massacre into a symbol of victory, and wept for all that had been lost. The memorial was dedicated 1 year after the massacre, a simple structure of white marble bearing the names of the 847 people confirmed to have died in Liberation Square and its immediate aftermath. The true number was probably higher. Some bodies had never been recovered. Some victims had died of their injuries in the chaotic days that followed. But this was the count that the Truth Commission had been able to verify. President Marshall attended the dedication ceremony, the first American president to visit Valdoria since the revolution. He stood alongside Miriam Hosseini and other leaders of the new government, before a crowd of tens of thousands who had gathered to honor the dead and celebrate the living. 1 year ago, brave men and women gathered in this square to demand their freedom, Marshall said. They came peacefully, armed only with their voices and their conviction that change was possible. They were met with bullets and tanks and the full fury of a regime that valued power over humanity. He paused, his eyes moving across the crowd, seeing faces that had known suffering but also displayed hope. Many of them died here in this square. Their blood soaked these stones. Their voices were silenced by violence. But their dream did not die with them. It lived on in the survivors who refused to be broken. It lived on in the activists who documented the truth despite the risks. It lived on in the soldiers who chose conscience over orders. It lived on in all of you who continued to fight even when fighting seemed hopeless. He gestured to the memorial, to the names carved in white marble. These names represent real people. Sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, friends and lovers and neighbors. Each one of them mattered. Each one of them deserved to live in freedom. And each one of them is honored today, not just with this memorial, but with the free society that you are building from the ashes of tyranny. Marshall stepped back from the podium, and Miriam Hosseini took his place. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people she had fought alongside, hidden with, mourned with. She thought about all the words she could say, all the emotions she could express, all the weight of the past year that pressed down on her shoulders. In the end, she kept it simple. They wanted us to be afraid, she said. They wanted us to believe that resistance was futile, that their power was absolute, that hope was naive. For a long time, many of us did believe that. We kept our heads down. We accepted what we could not change. We survived. She paused, gathering herself. But then we decided to stop being afraid. We decided that survival without dignity was not really living. We decided that our children deserved better than we had known. We decided to gather in this square and demand our freedom, whatever the cost. Her voice broke slightly, but she continued. The cost was high, higher than any of us imagined. But here we stand 1 year later in a country that is free, because they were willing to pay that cost. The names on this memorial are not just victims. They are heroes. They are the foundation on which this new Valdoria is built. And we will honor them not just with words and memorials, but with the society we create, with the freedoms we protect, with the promise that their sacrifice was not in vain. She stepped back from the podium, and the crowd erupted in applause that echoed off the buildings surrounding the square, that seemed to reach up to the sky itself, that carried with it all the grief and joy and hope of a nation reborn. The sun was setting over Liberation Square, painting the memorial in shades of gold and red. The names carved in white marble seemed to glow in the fading light. Thousands of lives reduced to letters and numbers, but somehow still present, still felt, still honored. Miriam stood before the memorial after the crowds had dispersed, reading names she knew, touching the carved letters with fingers that trembled slightly. She thought about the friends she had lost, about the elderly man whose head had exploded beside her, about the teenage boy she had pulled from the chaos and who had later died from wounds she hadn't known he was carrying. She thought about the price of freedom, about whether it was worth paying, about whether those who had paid it would approve of the country that was being built in their names. There were no easy answers. There never were. The new Valdoria was imperfect, struggling with the legacy of decades of repression, facing challenges that would take generations to fully address. The scars of the massacre and the civil conflict that followed would never fully heal. The trauma lived on in survivors who woke from nightmares, in families who would never be whole again, in a national psyche that had been profoundly shaped by violence. But there was also hope, real hope, not the desperate grasping that had characterized the days before the massacre, but the grounded hope of people who had fought for their freedom and won it. Elections were being held, institutions were being built, a free press was emerging, civil society was flourishing. The changes were imperfect and incomplete, but they were real. Miriam thought about what she would do with the rest of her life, now that the revolution she had helped win was becoming the mundane work of governance. She had been offered positions in the new government, ambassadorships, leadership roles that would have been unimaginable a year ago. She had declined them all, at least for now. She needed time to heal, to process, to figure out who she was beyond the revolutionary who had filmed a massacre and inspired a nation. She would find her path. They all would. The future was uncertain but open, no longer constrained by the suffocating control of a regime that saw its people as subjects rather than citizens. Whatever came next, it would be their choice to make. She touched the memorial one last time, whispered a prayer for the dead, and walked out of Liberation Square into the gathering twilight. Behind her, the names carved in marble stood silent witness to the price that had been paid. Before her, a new country waited to be built. The sun set on Valdoria, and a new day began.